Same sentence. I don't know what's up with that. Well, it's really great to be back, and really it's fantastic what I get to do this morning. You know, when Pastor asked me if I would introduce my father, I said yes very quickly, and then I realized maybe I should have thought about that a little bit more. Not because I'm not excited to introduce my dad, because I am, but because I was concerned that maybe I would not give him the honor that he deserved. So my father is many things to many people. If I was to make a list of all the things that he has been, I would be here all day and you guys would be bored and want to go to lunch. But, you know, he's done a lot of things in his life and been a lot of different, held a lot of different roles and worn a lot of different hats. And not all of those roles didn't contain all of him. So he's been a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If I was to get 100 people together and ask them to describe him, I would get 100 different pictures, and none of them would match the picture that I have of him, right? If I did that, I might get things like they might call him honorable or ethical or hardworking or intelligent or determined. Some people might say he was funny, friendly, creative, or intense. Out of deference to him, they probably wouldn't mention that he can be stubborn and a little controlling and difficult, even though he can be. But all of them would say that he was generous. He's always given of what he has to make other people's lives better. You know, he would buy you a meal or fix your dishwasher or your air conditioner or whatever was broken, or give you advice or give you a ride. And as he progressed through life, it became more and more possible for him to give of his own money and direct the money of his company and the resources of our company to help people, and he's done that. But as his life has taken a lot of turns that ended up taking him to places that he would not have chosen to go and be places that he doesn't choose to, that he would not have chosen to be, I think he's responded by giving the people around him something that's much more important than all of that, more valuable than all of that. He's given us his own story. I know that as you listen to him this morning, you're going to be encouraged by what he says, even though he's not sure he knows what he's going to say yet this morning. He told me earlier. And I'm sure that what he says is going to be honoring to God, because that's something that has always marked his life. So at this time, I would like you to help me welcome my father, and I'm sure your friend, Tom Hill.
Is that on? What? Well, good morning. Somebody came up to me and said, "You going to preach this morning?" I said, "No, I'm not going to preach this morning." They said, "Well, you're going to teach this morning?" I said, "No, I'm not going to teach this morning." They said, "Well, why'd you come?" And I agree with them. And Jerry asked me actually about a month and a half ago, if I would take this morning, since he was going to be gone, except at that time I didn't know he was going to be gone. And people have learned something about me. They've learned that if they ask me far enough in advance to do something, I'll say yes. Because I don't think about the fact, I don't think about doing it and what it's going to require until we get real close to it. And then I say no. So, but Jerry asked me to talk about living a generous life. And giving to the Lord and giving of your resources to the Lord. And I've worked on that for a couple of weeks now, and usually about 12 or 13, 14 hours before I'm supposed to talk, it starts to come together. Well, this never came together, which is kind of discouraging to me. And then I realized this morning that one of the problems I was having was I really don't have anything to give to God. Because everything already belongs to God. And I was reminded of one of two men that I greatly admired and still do and have modeled much of my life after. And his name is R.G. Letourneau. Do any of you know who R.G. Letourneau is? I give my grandsons, when they turn 12 years old, I give them 4 books. And one of the books is a book entitled Mover of Men and Mountains. And it's a book about R.G. Letourneau. And it was one of Garmin's favorite books, and my father-in-law, and so the other man I greatly admire. And he told me about this book, and I thought, well, if he thinks it's a good book, I ought to read it. So I got it from his bookshelf and read it. And R.G. Letourneau was an amazing man. He was a welder. And he went to California and was working out there before all of the fields were planted and all of those orange trees and strawberries and everything else was being grown out there. And his job was to level those fields so that they could irrigate the fields by running water down through the between the rows, because they would stack the dirt up fairly high and they would plant the things on that stack of dirt, and then they would run the water down through between the rows. Well, he found that it was difficult to level the fields because he had a grader kind of machine, and the wheels were just about 8 feet apart from front to rear. And he thought about that, and he thought if the wheels were further apart, it would smooth it out more quickly. So he made one where the wheels on this grader were about 40 feet apart. And it worked extremely well. And he began to level these fields, and people began to contract with him because he could do such a good job. He thought of many different things like that. R.G. Letourneau was the first one to put rubber tires on tractors. Think about that. Now, I don't know if any tractors don't have rubber tires on them. He was the first one to actually put motors in the wheels of equipment and use the engine to drive a generator, which then drove the motors in the wheels. And then you could power and control each wheel individually. Almost everything that Caterpillar and the other companies make, he invented. But there was something else about R.G. Letourneau. By the way, he also started a college in Longview, Texas, and my grandson just graduated from there about a month ago with a degree in engineering. And he began that college to do 2 things. One was to teach welding, and it's one of the few schools in the nation that you can actually get a bachelor's degree in welding. And the other one was to teach pilots how not only to fly a plane, but how to fix the engines and how to fix the airframes, because it was primarily for pilots who were going to be on the mission field, and they needed to be able to take care of their airplane. So you graduate with a degree as a pilot, but you also have an airframe mechanic degree and an engine mechanic degree at the same time. Whenever he was saved, he was convinced he needed to give 10% to the Lord. So he started giving 10%. Then as he began to give, he began to think, I need to give more. And at the end of his life, he was giving 90% of his income to the Lord and living on 10%. Well, his motto was very simple. He said, it's not how much of my money I give to the Lord, but how much of the Lord's money I keep for myself. Now think about that a minute. It's pretty hard to talk about giving something to somebody when they already own it. If I came out in the parking lot and you were sitting in the driver's seat of your car, I said, Tim, I'm going to give you this car. And what'd you say to me? You'd say, wait a minute, Tom, I already own this car. I think that that's kind of the situation we are with the Lord whenever we think about giving to the Lord. He already owns it. 1 Corinthians 10:26 says, for the earth is the Lord's and all that it contains. All that it contains. Not some, but all. And God has just been gracious to allow us to have use of it. I could just stop now. Thank you, son. Actually, didn't need to start because Ben actually took care of it before I started. But I want to tell a story. Probably most of you know this story. But Jesus is teaching in the temple courts. Jesus spent a lot of time teaching in the temple courts. And he would take his disciples and go in there, and he would use what was going on there many times to teach. I think some of you know about the time that he wove the whip and tore the tables down and spread the money everywhere that they were trading and making money on, as well as the animals. And anyway, at this particular time, they were, by the way, the disciples and the people enjoyed his teaching in the temple courts, because typically when he was teaching, it was at the brunt of his teaching was the Pharisees. And so as he was teaching, the Pharisees were the ones that the disciples and the people saw that they were catching it from Jesus. And so they enjoyed that, they kind of liked that. But Jesus was teaching, and he was across the temple floor from where the Pharisees and the others put their offerings when they came into the temple. Now, I picture this as a big brass pot that if you threw coins or whatever into it, it would make a lot of noise. Now, some of you might remember when we were raising money for the furnace that we had a 55-gallon drum over here. And at the beginning of the service, the kids would come down and deposit their gifts in that 55-gallon drum. And I sat over here and I watched these kids, and most of them would throw it in there to see how much noise it would make. And I think that's what the Pharisees were doing. They were throwing their money into this collection pot, and they wanted it to make noise because it drew attention to them and what they were giving. And it kind of had the effect of letting people know how wealthy they were. Because the more they had, the more they could give, and the more they put in there, and the louder noise it made. Well, the Pharisees were doing that. All that's my supposition, by the way. None of that's in the Bible. So the Pharisees, this part is, were putting their money in there, and along came a widow. And she quietly dropped 2 coins in that pot, which was about the equivalent today of 2 pennies. As she put that in there, it was a great juxtaposition to what the Pharisees had put in there. So Jesus used this as an example, and people were thinking, including his disciples, were thinking, she didn't put much in there. But Jesus said she put in the most. Because the Pharisees put in what they put in out of their plenty. She put in what she put in there out of her poverty. She put in the last 2 pennies she had. Now think about that a minute. And I don't think that this means that if you are down to your last $2 or your last $10 that you're supposed to give it to. I don't think it means that at all. I think that what Christ was trying to teach at that time, at least one of the things that he was trying to teach, it's not what you give that counts as much, it's what you have left after you give. So a person who has a lot and gives a lot hasn't given nearly as much as a person who has very little and gives a lot. A lot compared to what they have. Another thing that the Bible says about that, or something like that, is that when you give, your left hand shouldn't know what your right hand is doing. That you give in secret. Now, if your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing, I don't know how anybody else would know what your right hand is doing, right? But it has become very, very difficult in today's society to do very much or give very much without people knowing about it. It's very difficult. Because, you know, you give here, and on Monday morning, we have counters that take the envelopes and the money and count it so they know. You have somebody that has to enter all this into records, and they know. And, you know, that information kind of has a way of kind of getting out somehow. Not purposefully, but it has a way. So it's very difficult to do things in the church and to give things without it being found out. And as a result, people are judged by what they do or what they don't do. And sometimes they're judged, and it's like you come up with the right answer, and sometimes you come up with the wrong answer. But we shouldn't judge people according to things that are done, are we? Obviously, some people can do things other people can't do, but what they're doing is not maybe as important or cost as much percentage-wise or from the standpoint of how much the person owns as the other person, what they give. So my point is, every person that gives can be a generous giver. You don't have to give an awful lot of money to be a generous giver. A generous giver is one who gives not so much out of their prosperity, but out of their poverty. A generous giver gives, it's what you have left after you give. And every person can be a generous giver. Generosity is giving, has a profound effect on people. I was raised in a situation where we didn't have a lot of money. As a matter of fact, my mother was a seamstress, and some of the ladies might remember this or know it, she covered buttons and belt buckles and belts for ladies' dresses. And she had a machine that she would have these metal, two parts of a button, and she would wrap the one with material and put it in there and pull down on the handle, and it'd press them together, and so the lady had a button for her dress out of the same material that the dress was made. And the ladies would come by and pick their things up after they got off work, which was around 5 o'clock or whatever, 5:15. It's a small town. You could get off work and be at our house in 2 or 3 minutes. No traffic, by the way. And after they'd leave, she'd call usually me or my sister, to come in, and she'd send us to the store. And it was 2 blocks to a Safeway, and we'd go to the Safeway, and we would purchase the things that we were going to have for dinner that night. So we didn't have a larder full or a pantry full of things that you could go pull things, groceries out of and make dinner. We didn't know what was for dinner until we went to the store and bought it. And we didn't realize, at least I didn't realize, that we were really kind of a poor family until I was quite a bit older. Certainly didn't realize that as a child. But we would go to church, and my mom and dad didn't go to church, but all the kids did. And we didn't give anything. But I would see in the pews around me, I would see as the offering was passed, the parents would give the kids a dime or a quarter or something that they could put in the offering plate. And they would take out of their billfold $5 or $10 or maybe $20 and put that in the offering plate. What was being taught about giving as that took place? You can talk to me. I don't have to do all the talking. What was being taught about giving? Yeah, give your spare change. Yeah, children learn that. We think they are. But what are the children learning about giving? You give your spare change. Pardon? No, not giving of yourself. Pardon? All right. But are we teaching them to plan about their giving before they come to church? Pardon me? Yeah. Yeah. And you don't decide before you come how much you're going to give. You just, as the plate passed, you check and give whatever you have, a few coins or whatever. And so that's my picture of how you gave. When I got older, got married, we didn't go to church for the first 4 or 5 years that we were married. My wife was raised going to church every Sunday. When they would go on vacation, she says that on Sunday morning as they were driving, the girls would change to their Sunday dresses in the back seat, and they'd find a church and stop and go to church. And then they'd get back in and they would drive on their vacation. They always went to church on Sunday. So it was quite a change when we got married and we didn't go to church. When I came back from overseas and our son was born, Thomas, and I thought, maybe we ought to go to church. So we started going to church, and we didn't give money. We didn't give anything to the offering unless we reached in my billfold and took out a $5 or a couple of dollars and dropped that in the plate. We didn't think about how much to give or give anything. We came back to Oklahoma City and went to college, and I began to spend time with Mr. Kimmel, her father. And I discovered that he spent a lot of time deciding what to give. As a matter of fact, twice a year, he would make a decision about not only what to give to the church, but what to give to missionaries and other groups. And twice a year, he would write checks to missionaries and or to the organizations that he was supporting. But he thought about it very carefully and gave to those people and those organizations and to his church. And later on, at that time, he was given to the church every 6 months. Well, it's very difficult for your church to deal with that kind of gifting. They do a whole lot better if they get it monthly or get it weekly than they do every 6 months or every year. So he began giving to his church every month, at the first of every month. And I watched him do that, and I thought, maybe that's what we ought to do. Maybe we ought to be giving every month or every week. And maybe we ought to decide before we go to church how much to give. I remember we had not been giving, and I had never given. Not really. And so as we began to do that, I was challenged to give 10%. And so we started giving 10%. And we gave 10%. And then Kay and I were talking one time, and we thought, you know what? We've been married for 4 or 5 years. We hadn't given all that time. Maybe we should try to give the money that we didn't give over that period of time. Just, can we do that? And so we began to give more to try to catch up for the 4 or 5 years. And as we caught up, we thought, you know, we've done it so far, why don't we just continue? But the point was, as we gave, we enjoyed it. We enjoyed giving. And we enjoyed the results of it. And it got to where it was, can we give more? Just in order, because we enjoyed it so much. As a matter of fact, we'd rather do that than some of the other things that we were doing. And I think that a lot of people miss the joy of giving. It's more of a, if you do give, sometimes it's more of a drudgery than it is a joy. But giving should be joyful, and it should give you joy when you give. And I think a lot of it has to do with the attitude that we approach it with. But it makes a tremendous difference, not only to you, but to the people you give to. As you all know, I'm one of the trustees, and the trustees get together every December and work on the budget for the following year. And usually there's a kind of a survey to see how much people think they're going to be giving the next year. And we usually end up with a figure of, what was it, Ben, $200 and some thousand, and wouldn't even pay the salaries of all the staff we had. So we went to the different directors of the different ministries and departments within the church. We said, you all pray about what you believe God would have you accomplish and do, what he would have you do this next year. And then you tell us what it's going to take financially to do it. So they do that, and then we add it all up. And this last year, it came out to be about $420,000, twice what people had said they were going to give. But then we look at that, and we say, if God has told them this is what they're to do, how can we take it out of the budget? So we leave it in there, and what do we call the budget? A faith budget, because that's what it is. We're going on faith, or, you know, are we going to meet this or not? And so when Ben was up here talking about what it takes on a weekly basis to meet the budget, that's that faith budget that we stood in and sat down there in the parlor and voted on. And voted 100% of the people that were there to support that budget. And I think that, like that pastor he talked about, I don't believe it's a problem. I think all that it requires is that we think about our giving before we come to church instead of while we're sitting here and the basket's being passed. And I think if you thought about it before you came to church and filled out that check and put it in that envelope and brought it with you, we'd have no problem meeting that budget. Now, why should you even put it in an envelope and bring it? We have people that say, you know, I don't do that. I just drop it in and I do all my gifting that way. Well, I got news for you. If we add up all that coins and change dropped in there, not very much. Most of it comes from those people who write a check or put it in an envelope and bring it. And why do that? Well, for several reasons. I think it's good for you to have an accounting of how much you gave. Because it's real easy to think one thing when something else has happened. To feel like you did something when you didn't actually do it. It's easy but when you get that piece of paper from the church that says this is what you've given, you know what it is. And then you know whether or not you reached your goal, personal goal, not what you told the church, but your personal goal about what to give. By the way, you also know you have a record for the IRS if you need that. And if you're going to count it against your taxes, you have to have that. But if that's what we did, if all of us, two things would happen. First of all, I don't think our annual gifting would be $400,000 and some thousand. I think it'd be $500,000 or $600,000. And we would be able to minister more than we are today. Kay and I love to give to this church because what's happening? Do you know how many baptisms the average Baptist church has? Steve, do you know? 1. And you know where it comes from? Children in the church. How many did we have last year?
19 students and about 15 other people from outside of our
No, I mean the total number of lights that were lit. Pardon?
over 170.
Over 170. Do you know whenever other churches hear about the number of salvations and baptisms in this church, they don't believe it because of the size of the church. But it's happening because of the ministries in this church. You know, we work with some Campus Crusade people, and I love Campus Crusade. It's nothing, but we work with some Campus Crusade people that never see a person saved. Yet looks, the only other ministry that has more salvations a year than here that I know of is Reaching Souls. And nobody can match that. What is it, 40-some cents of salvation? 35 cents. It goes down every year. I mean, can't beat that. And you say, well, you can't put a price on a person's soul. No, you can't. But I tell you what, if I'm going to invest in something, I want to know where my money's given the best return. And here and there are the two places. that you get the best return for your money from that standpoint. But whenever I see that board and those lights light up, it tickles my heart. And I'm glad that we gave what we gave, whatever it was, to the church. Because the ministry that's being performed here, what's going on in the community, this church is making a difference in the community here. It's making a difference in these schools. A big difference. And it's because of your gifts. That ought to give you a lot of joy, a lot of happiness to be thinking about that and to know what's going on. And you can have a bigger part of it easily. Now, I'm not sure this is what Pastor Jerry thought about whenever he asked me to talk. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it wasn't. But you know what? I think this is what God laid on my heart. And I think about it, and I think about all the different things, and this is probably the most important thing to this church that's going on right now. I think about the furnace. When the last couple of, it's warm today comparatively, but the last couple of Sundays when it was just bitter cold, did you enjoy the furnace? Did it tickle your heart that we had a furnace and that you helped put that in? I think it probably did. Because it meant something to us. Those lights mean something for eternity. And we could have twice as many lights, Anyway. To be a generous giver anybody can be a generous giver. You do not have to have a lot of money. My mother was a generous giver. She spent her life raising 5 kids. She could have done a lot of different things, but that's what she did. She was a generous giver. So it's not all about money. We have a lot of people in this church that give their time and their effort, and they're constantly doing things. We have people in this church that you never go to the hospital and they're not there. They're there every time. Doesn't matter who you are. They're there. That's a generous giver, making a difference, a huge difference. We've got some wonderful, wonderful people in this church. And I love this church. And I haven't been here as long as people like Janie and Ben, and I could point out a lot of people have been here longer than I've been alive. Only Ben, not Janie. But y'all are a gracious group of people to let me come up here and ramble on for a while, and I appreciate it. And I want to let you go because it's already 11:43. And who's going to come up and... Thank you, guys.
Thank you, sir. Test.
Thank you.
As encouraging, but let us not forget the challenge that he said to consider giving away what belongs to someone else. That's a silly thought. I can't give Tim a car that he owns. God gives us things to steward, to use those things for his purposes. How much can I give away? How much of my time, how much of my money, how much of my resources can I give away to the kingdom of God? And I don't think we put a total on that. I don't think you put a limit on that. I don't think you put an expectation. Consider before. I think that's one thing I heard. Think about it before I come to gather with you guys. Think about it monthly. Do a reevaluation twice a year. These are good practical suggestions on how I can give my time, my money, other resources. Thank you very much.